We're back with part 3 of lecture number 4. We were talking about muckraking journalists such as Ida Tarbell, who are looking into the sometimes illegal practices of corporations seeking to establish a monopoly during the period. So now's a good time for us to understand what a monopoly is. Mono means one. So think about that. When you think about what a monopoly is, it means one company dominates an entire industry, meaning that there are no competitors, there are no other corporations that produce the same product, or there are no other service providers that provide the same service as you do. Why would a corporation want to be the only one in existence in their particular sector of the economy? Because it can come with some significant financial upside. First and foremost, if you're the only place that a consumer can buy a product from, then you own that entire market. There's no sharing of profits with another rival corporation. Further, if you're the only place that someone can get something from, either a good or a service, then your customer really needs you. And they're going to need you so much that they really are kind of trapped. Meaning that if you have a monopoly in a particular industry, you can start to play around with the prices. By play around, I mean increase them over time. This will fatten your balance sheet at the end of the year. If you can continually hike prices on your products, then your company is just going to continue to rake in the cash over time. Customers will complain, of course. They'll say, well, this is the second price raise in 1 year. What's going on here? They can complain, they can stomp their feet, but they literally have nowhere else to go to secure that product or service. So you can see there are several powerful incentives for corporations to chase out their competitors and for them to be the only one controlling that particular sector. A monopoly, in other words, is the antithesis of a free market economy in which you have healthy competition between businesses, which keeps prices in check, which keeps consumers from being gouged and gives consumers the ability to shop it around to find the best value for their money. We're going to begin to see the work, though, of these muckraking journalists putting a dent in the reputation of some of these monopolistic corporations during the Gilded Age. As the public begins to read about some of these illicit activities that have led to them dominating a particular industry, they're going to become angry. They're going to become concerned. For the leaders in these particular industries, though, the ones that are making the money off of this control, they're worried. They need to make sure that everything stays the same. They don't want things to change. They don't want there to be new competitors in the field. Proponents of these large businesses will fight back by arguing that this was all a natural part of the growth of the U.S.'s economy over time. They will argue that there's nothing wrong with monopolies. There's nothing wrong with trusts, which is another term for large corporations that will end up kind of working towards their own benefit. What is the basis for their claim that this is just a natural development in the economy of the United States? They're going to adopt a view known as social Darwinism. Presumably you're all familiar with Charles Darwin, his theory of evolution from your biology classes, the idea of survival of the fittest, that those organisms that can adapt to environmental challenges the best are the ones that can continue to secure food and live long enough to reproduce and pass along those genes to the next generation. That is a biological principle. English philosopher Herbert Spencer, however, will take this principle from biology and begin to apply it to human behavior, something it was never intended to apply to. Spencer and advocates of social Darwinism will begin arguing that just like certain organisms in nature can outcompete others for resources and live on and thrive, that human beings are the same way. That for many of these businesses that dominate their respective industry, that might enjoy a monopoly or have a trust, then they deserve it. that they have simply been led by individuals who are smarter than other business owners, that they have worked harder, that in other words, they have been rewarded in a sense by getting a monopoly because they have outcompeted all of their rivals in the same field. Therefore, they're going to claim that this is just a natural process. This is just like nature selecting certain birds to outcompete other birds. This is just nature selecting which businesses should go under and which ones should dominate particular industries. Advocates also argued that because this was a supposedly natural process, that there should be no government intervention to try and stop the creation of monopolies. In fact, we're going to see that proponents of this belief system argued that the U.S. government, should keep their hands out of the private sector, that the government should adopt a laissez-faire attitude towards the economy. Laissez-faire simply means hands off. They are arguing against any form of government investigation of these mega corporations. They're arguing against any sort of reform of the private sector, any sort of investigations into price fixing or collusion among these great trusts. And in order to ensure this hands-off policy by the government, it was not uncommon during this period for big business leaders to bribe politicians. I know that's shocking in our day and time to think that a politician could be swayed by monetary contributions. But during the Gilded Age, it was quite commonplace. You can see the political cartoon that I have here on the slide depicting U.S. senators, and look how they're all bloated with the cash that has been sent in, all these campaign donations being sent in by corporations anxious to make sure that they are pretty much left alone to continue their activities unsupervised. And in such an unregulated environment, wealth bloomed for a few, especially at the top. For example, before the Civil War, there were just a handful of millionaires in the United States. By 1892, however, there were more than 4,000 millionaires in the United States. And it was not your average Joe that was making this amount of money. Eventually, however, as cries from the public grew louder over the growing influence, both economic influence and political influence, of these titans of big business, the government did decide to intervene, albeit in a slight way. In 1890, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which sought to break up monopolies and curb the influence of conglomerations such as Standard Oil Corp. The legislation declared, for instance, that, quote, every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce, is hereby declared to be illegal. Yet, while at first glance this seems to be a clear indictment of monopolies and the overweening influence of wealthy entrepreneurs such as Rockefeller or Carnegie, the very combinations and trusts that this piece of legislation targeted were poorly defined. And this was not accidental. For instance, lawmakers were vague on the issue of what actually constituted restraint of trade. It was also unclear who would make these determinations so that the law might actually be enforced. To put it another way, this document was so loosely worded and there were no real enforcement mechanisms put into it that it will be incredibly easy for corporations that are charged under the terms of this act to wriggle off the hook, to not actually be found guilty and broken apart. For instance, of the 8 cases that were brought before federal courts under the terms of the Sherman Antitrust Act between 1890 and 1893, the federal government lost 7 out of these 8 cases. Let's be clear. The problems with this document are not accidental. This document was deliberately crafted to look good to the public, but to not actually do anything in the end to break up monopolies. Remember all those campaign contributions that some of these largest corporations were sending to state senators, to federal senators? Yeah, that money is an investment in that particular politician, an investment that, okay, we give you the money now, and if any sort of law comes up that might threaten our existence as a corporation, you will vote against that law. In this case, these legislators had to create something to pacify the public, but it's a toothless piece of legislation. Again, it's deliberately made to be weak so that these corporations won't actually have to suffer any consequences. Making money was the name of the game during the Gilded Age, and it wasn't just muckrakers who dished out harsh criticism of the naked greed of the era. As Mark Twain asked of his fellow Americans in his 1873 book, The Gilded Age, he asked, quote, "What is the chief end of man?" He answered, "To get rich." In what way? Dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must. In other words, while Twain's novel is a work of fiction, it really is sort of emblematic of the reigning philosophy of the day, which was, I'm going to get my money somehow, and if I can break the law and do it, I'll do it. If I have to be honest, then I will, but I'm still going to look for another way to make money.